You guys ready to get rolling?
We've been rolling, dude. Here.
We're not rolling?
This is what we've been rolling.
You guys are professionals.
And you can get Listen Up for only $14.99.
We're not sure what's going to happen today on the way. But we are here with my friend John Stevens, who is the pastor at Chapelwood United Methodist Church in Houston, Texas, and then Matt Russell, who's his co-host at Pod Have Mercy. And Matt, I got no idea what you do at Chapelwood.
I don't either.
He does all the things that I do not want to do.
That's great.
It is. He's our executive pastor. I call him the water walker because he kind of innovates creative ministry and and he's the smart one on the podcast.
That's not true. We just have different reading lists.
We'll come back to that. I'm kind of interested to see what's on y'all's reading lists right now. So y'all have a podcast, Pod Have Mercy. Is that correct? I'm saying that.
That is correct.
I'm known for mispronouncing a lot of stuff on the podcast. So tell us a little bit about your podcast. This is the first time we've ever had two podcasts on one podcast.
Correct. This is it was crossing the stream.
It's like a turducken in a podcast.
Cancel each other out. So Pod Have Mercy, we started the podcast in February of 2020.
Right.
And there's one of the first two episodes, I tell Matt, I said, hey, have you heard of this thing? This it's COVID or something. Have you heard of this thing? So we have documented historical kind of oral history since COVID, but but we've been doing it. We started it out as another platform here in Houston at Chapelwood, Discipleship, and we really just wanted to talk the conversation between the two of us. We have guests, and really just talk about faith and spirituality, but not from a real super churchy kind of perspective. And so it's been an adventure. Yeah. We've done a little bit of everything. So we're on YouTube, and of course all the streaming platforms. So, of course, all your people who follow the weight should go like and subscribe. God have mercy.
We will make sure that we push. You're probably a bigger podcast than us. So
I don't know about that. I will say if you want some like really good stuff, the weight is where you go. Like when I mean, you guys have interviewed.
John,
I'm just being serious. We're not serious here a lot, but you guys have had some really strong guests and had some really deep conversations, and so I'm kind of jealous. You know, my humor is covering up the fact that I'm very insecure that we don't have quite.
But we're killing it in Slovakia.
We are number one in Slovakia.
We are crushing it, dude. So
I can see that. Looking at John's picture earlier from high school, that would appeal.
Listen, Richard Marks is
the Richard
making
Marks
a comeback.
picture would appeal to those in Slovakia. So we've enjoyed what we started kind of at the same time. Chris, was that March of 2020 that we started? Or
it was around then. Yeah, it was around then. I think that alongside everyone else in America, we were trying to figure out what to do when nobody showed up to church. And so, it's been a lot of fun. It definitely, for, most of ministry is producing or creating some kind of thing that people come to in a place. It's been fun to have a conversation that extends out in a lot of different directions, and really it's given us an opportunity, I think, to pursue conversations that we're passionate about, and those have gone sometimes in serious direction, sometimes in the direction of things that we just think are awesome, and so that's good. I was going to ask Matt, what's your background? How did you end up at Chapelwood?
So I grew up in Dallas, went to seminary at Fuller Seminary, and then came to my first appointment was actually here in the late 90s in my mid 20s, and I planted a church within a church called Mercy Street. That really is reaching out to folks that have it's kind of a church for folks that hate church, and it reaches out to folks in recovery, prison, disaffected. It's kind of what we used to call a redemptive freak show, because you just never knew who's going to show up. I went and did my PhD after that and studied developmental psychology, how people change and sustain change out of trauma. And then I did a postdoc in Cambridge and thought I wanted to be a professor, and did that for a while, and just realized that my calling was to be a pastor. So I came back to Houston and was here. And then John and I started talking, and it just made sense to kind of come back on staff here. And I've just loved it. I feel like I've kind of hit my stride being in ministry with John and kind of partnering in the city with him. And so it just feels it's best years of my life in ministry.
Well, Mercy Street is one of those great gifts. We've sent people to Mercy Street from this church. When I was in Hattiesburg, we sent people as well to go look at Mercy Street to just help rethink recovery ministry and ways to engage people in the places where they're really living that sometimes I think established church or Big C church has difficulty doing. So
tell people, for folks who don't know, maybe just say a couple more words about it, about Mercy Street.
Yeah, I mean, it really was born out of, I did a number of interviews, about probably 70 over a span of about a year, of people that had left the church and just met with folks in a coffee shop and just asked them why. Kind of gave them exit interviews. And out of that, I began to meet folks that were in recovery, some kind of recovery, which really precipitated my own my own journey in long-term recovery now. And after about 9 months, we just gathered those folks up at a woman's house who was had a dinner. And I just shared the findings of what I had learned from all these interviews. And the next week we held a coffee. And I said, if you want to do something about it, why don't we think about creating some kind of community that is an antidote to all these things that are wrong with church. And so we started doing that. And we had somebody in the community who was doing announcements said that you're either sitting next to someone from Penn State or the state pen, which was really right, because we had folks that were coming out of MD Anderson, folks there that were in the CEOs from that, and then also folks that were just coming out of prison, and all of those folks were just mixing. It was something that I could have never imagined. And this church's vision for it, the ability of this church, the capacity for this church to embrace people that did not look like them, did not live in this neighborhood, would never have found this church on a map, to be wrapped up it was amazing, and still is. This church's DNA is deeply kind of connected to that kind of solidarity with the world.
And John, when did you come to Chapelwood? And just remind me, you've told me the story before, but maybe for folks who don't know it, kind of what's your ministry been like there?
Yeah, so I came in 2014 from the coast of Georgia, where I'd been on St. Simon's Island, Sea Island, and everybody. And one question I get the most is, why in the hell did you leave there to come here? And, God calls you to places and spaces. But it's been great. It's been a great ride. I would say the first 20 years of ministry were one thing, and I think the last 10 years here have been something different, very unique. I would say about the last 7 years. But you guys know this, and people who listen would know that the world has changed a lot. I wouldn't say just since 2020, but probably 2016 ish, 2015. So yeah, it's been fun, but I would say it's been the hardest season of ministry, and probably just been the hardest season of life for a lot of people.
The last 5 years have been the hardest 20 years of ministry.
It's
for a lot
true.
of pastors. It seems, talking to pastors from my seat now, working with an organization outside the local church who works with local churches, pastors are tired. I hear this over and over, not just United Methodist pastors, but pastors are weary. The culture wars have really worn on pastors. And even a while back, I was thinking about some of the things that I would post 10 years ago on social media. They were kind of on the edge or challenging things. Back then, people would roll with it. And now there's just this kind of anger or pushback that exists in the culture. And I'm sure y'all see that.
Oh, of course. I tell people the devil lives in the comment section of social media. I mean, and that goes to one of the things that, like, it's been on, we've talked about this a lot and it's been is like one of the things we address here on our podcast is we're not afraid to talk about the hypocrisy of the church. I mean, we're a church, and we work at a church, and we're not afraid to call out the crap that sometimes the church has really contributed to. And one of the things I say a lot is that the biggest threat to American Christianity are Christians, in my opinion. I mean, I don't think it's the culture or the liberals or whatever people say. I think Christianity in America is deeply troubled in a lot of ways. Not across the board. There's some great things happening, but it just has awakened us to the fact that when people say, like now, a lot of young people say, I don't have a problem with Jesus, but I don't see Jesus in the church.
Right.
And so when young people are leaving the church, or when people have a problem with the church, or they call it, instead of me becoming defensive about that, I just say, you're not wrong. I mean, you're actually right.
I was talking with a church leader, an Episcopalian church leader this morning, and he pointed out the fact that the thing that Ryan Burge talks about a lot, which is the COVID was the very first plague in the last 2,000 years that the church did not explode and grow dramatically after that plague. After every other plague, you can track baptisms, you can look at new church plants, you can look at what people are writing about followers of Jesus following those. But after COVID, you didn't see that. We haven't seen that turn. I think what Ryan Burge said about that was the issue was you couldn't tell the Christians from anyone else in the culture. We sounded and looked exactly alike. What do y'all think about that?
Duh.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I was just saying, yeah. I mean, of course. I mean, I think when something that John and I have talked about is that often our Christianity has been co-opted by our political stances now. And so instead of standing and moving towards the world that God loves, right? So, kind of post-enlightened stuff has shoved all of our ways of understanding and following Jesus into discrete belief systems where they're not performative. It's not an embodied thing that moves me into how do I love my neighbor. It's thinking about my neighbor but doing nothing, and I can still consider myself to be a Christian, right? And every other, pre-enlightenment, there was this kind of embodied sense of like my neighbor was actually constituted my life. Right. And so I think that some of that is regaining and taking a hold of the fact is that our faith is a verb. It is not a set of belief systems that get us out of the world like an evacuation plan for the faithful. It really is an embodied set of things that move me. It's a praxis. It moves me into action in the world.
Yeah, I think been reading recently Brian McLaren's Stages of Faith, and it's like the American church, especially evangelicalism, is either stalled out or reverted back to like stages 1 and 2, which is very simplistic faith, very much dogma, very much belief systems,
us, them.
wrong, right, us, them, right, wrong, light, dark. And the only difference between stage 1 and stage 2 is that in stage 2, you still have the winning, losing, competitive, I win, you lose, but it's a more of a communal mentality than it is an individualistic mentality. Yeah. It's not just my faith, it's our faith. And then when you get into like stages 3 and 4, that's where I see that some churches are doing this and they're struggling with that. Stage 3 is perplexity, and you're willing to say, I may have some biases. I may be wrong about this. I need to be open and listen, And then stage 4 is it's harmony. It's revolutionary relationships where you finally realize that the Christian faith, and Matt says this all the time, so I'm stealing it from him because he's smarter than I am, is we're not a belief system.
He does have a PhD in a postdoc.
He does. And you heard him like Oxford and this
Cambridge.
And that. He's going to be a professor.
Oxford.
He always, what is it you say? We're not a believing system, we're a belonging system.
Yeah.
A system, we're a community of belonging, not a community of believing. And I think when you look at the difference between belief and faith, we've gotten really kind of lost our way into this dogmatic belief system. It's why, and one of the reasons why I sent you this earlier, it's like every school, every courthouse, they want to put up the 10 commandments, but they don't want to put up what Jesus said were the 2 greatest commandments. Love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. It's kind of like we really missed the mark.
You can't incarcerate people off of that. Come on.
I mean, look, the 10 commandments are great. I'm a fan of the 10 commandments, but
most of them.
So why do you think that is? Why is it that? I mean, what would be the deep need other than just people? I mean, it's one thing to say people are just immature or childish or something. I don't know. I think there may be something deeper going on there in terms of like why would people be leaning in a moment like this towards something like structure or order? It seems to me that there's a deep desire in the culture for, I mean, in a time where things feel utterly confusing, disorienting. I do think that, some basic structures of things that have not changed is something that people really lean towards. Matt, you were talking about your research on how people change. I think people experience the world as being changing rapidly. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know, I feel like people are looking for handholds that actually make sense. I'm not saying that the practice of putting up the 10 Commandments is one that I don't know. I feel like it's almost like a talisman rather than a real thing that people are like holding on to. But I just wonder what you think. Why do you think people are leaning towards those kinds of, those deep structures that feel solid when everything doesn't feel solid?
Mm.
We've been doing a series here, and we've been talking a lot about light and darkness. And this week about entering the darkness. In Exodus 20, when the commandments come down, God gives them to Moses out of this thick darkness. And the people say, we don't want to go there. We don't want to do that. I think part of it, there's a lot of reasons, Chris, for that. One of them is that I have said is we have failed as a church, and I take responsibility as a pastor for the past 20 to 30 years. We have not done a good job discipling people, making disciples. I think we've been very comfortable at preaching sermons and teaching Bible studies, but like I say around here, some of y'all in too many Bible studies. Because I know people who are in 5 Bible studies a week, and they are the meanest, most cantankerous, miserable human beings I've ever known in my life. You know what I'm talking about? And
there's a lady one time who in the middle of an argument told me that she had read, this has been 20 years ago, she had read the Bible through 5 times. Yeah. And I wanted to say, maybe read it again.
Remember, Fred Craddock was famous for saying, you can get an A in Bible and flunk Christianity.
And go to hell.
I mean, so I think that's a part of it. And so, Chris, I would say, I think when 2020, when the pandemic hit, and I think the racial recalibrations and the George Floyd and the Ahmaud Arbery, and I think then the vaccines and the masks and the politics of Trump and Clinton or Trump and Biden. I mean, all of these things together culturally put people in, like you said, in a place where it's beyond my control. And what Richard Rohr says is anger and fear are really all manifestations of grief. And so we're grieving either that things are changing too fast and out of my control, or things are not changing fast enough and out of my control.
Yeah.
And so I think we have a society that's very divided, like you said. And so the church, I don't think the church did a good enough job preparing people to deal with tension and disagreement and difficulty and struggle and darkness. We were not able to move through in the United Methodist Church, and I would say true as Episcopalians and Presbyterians and everyone else. We were not able to move through a season of disagreement on biblical interpretation about something that's not essential for salvation, by the way, on human sexuality. We couldn't move through that in a way that didn't end up with division and hatred and anger and fear and struggle. And of course, we Christians have been good at that for a long time, but I don't know. I think it's something for us to struggle with, to make sure that as we're moving forward and looking ahead, what is it that we need to do as the church in the world? How do we need to be in the world? How do we as pastors need to lead in the world in a way that kind of learns from the misses and the mistakes and maybe the things that we haven't done as well as we should. And I think, Chris, what you're asking is a good question. Is for me, it's more like, okay, how do we move forward now? What does it look like that we do a better job preparing people for the next big tense moment, which is going to come.
Right.
I mean, it's going to come.
Yeah, that's right.
I like the just the image of you, Matt, going out and doing interviews with people that have left the church. I do think that offers a very simple and very practical thing that people can do. Just, for various reasons. One is when you begin thinking about what has the church done or not done right, or how are we going to manage these larger kind of cultural upheavals. I do think I've gained a lot just by being in relationship with people that live in my neighborhood, making an intentional practice of going and having a cup of coffee at a coffee shop where most of the people that are there don't go to my church.
100%.
My wife was saying, I really like you when you're with people that don't go to church.
Yeah.
And I think that there's something powerful when I think it's less about, okay, we're Christian people and we're going to go out and do the Christian thing out in the world. It's another thing to say that Christ is the expression of the beauty, goodness, and truth of God, and the beauty, goodness, and truth of what it means to be human. And let's just go live that out in the world, and do the best we can to love other people. I do think that gets you far down the line. And then maybe that becomes an expression of a form of church. Something like Mercy Street. But I don't think that's not the answer. I think that's at least part of the answer. Local relationships, I think, are really important.
Yeah. I also think that we have a diminished understanding of Pentecost, and that if the Spirit of God has been poured out on all flesh, then the church does not own the Spirit. The Spirit is in the world, as Paul says, reconciling people back to the center of themselves in Christ. And so the church, and I think all these institutions are in flux. Zygmunt Bauman talks about, has this book called Liquid Modernity, where everything has been solid is now turning into much more of a fluid state. And so you have that with cryptocurrency, against the Federal Reserve. You have that with institutions like the church that used to be the authority on God, where that is, you have Wikipedia now probably is, so there's a total movement to the decentralization of secured power. And I think that that's important across the line for us to recognize and to understand that this is not just a church shift. This is a massive cultural shift that we're going through. And because of that, the center of what we thought was the world, right, Rome, is not, right? And I think Paul continues to say that it's the Christ between us. It's the relationships. And I think the church in the future is going to be much more hyper-local and much more hyper-relational. And I think those are the two things that I've got my eye on.
Yeah, I do think that, back to these larger upheavals that you were talking about, John, just within the denomination, I do wonder if it's even possible to do these large scale church projects. That's in a way that, I don't know. It makes it feels less possible today than it did 20 years ago to me.
Yeah,
and more possible to live out local expressions of the church, and to link up with other people, and to do that in a way that where you're more like networks. Networks of churches that are leaning in the same direction missionally, then we're going to build a global denomination that is going to, it just feels less possible to me than it used to. And I don't know. I think I'm way more interested in what's happening in local churches on the ground, because I think it's just more real.
It's a lot
I think
sexier.
Well, yeah. Well, and even in our tribe, the
speaking.
Book of Discipline, it says that the locus of ministry is the local church, and we sometimes forget that. When I think about our tribe, the great experiment when we merged with the EUB back in 1968, and this is going to be church history for folks who don't care about church history.
For those of you who'd like to take a nap during the podcast, this will be your moment.
Hit the 30-second forward, hit that button right now. When we had that moment in 1968, there was this reflective structure all the way through, from the top, all the way down to the smallest local church. Everybody was supposed to have the same 20 committees, even if you only had 25 people in your local church. And that was going all the way up. And it was that moment of structuring that was it never worked. And now I think we see this breadth of who can we be locally? And that's the most faithful thing for us. Who can we be in our community? How can we as a church talk to not just, I love what you did, Matt, talking to folks, but how can we talk to the police in our communities? How can we talk to teachers? How can we talk to the folks in recovery in our community and just say, what's the pain point? What do we need? Yeah. Where's the movement? Where's the opportunity to be the church of Jesus and draw people not into dogma, but into relationship? When you see the early church, and this is when I think about my reading of the early church, and Chris has heard this, so Chris is probably over there hitting the forward button too, is that the early church continued to strip dogma away in order to achieve the mission over and over and over. Whenever mission came up against dogma, the early church chose mission. You see that in Acts 15. You see it in Paul's letter to the Galatians. The point is to how do we become a place and not a place, but a people who allow others to experience good news and freedom and release and hope and life. And I think that sometimes just our conversations are so internal now that we miss that sense of how we can be very, very local. So now, if you've been pressing the forward thing, you can unpress the
I think
forward thing.
It's been funny to me to watch Methodists argue over this sort of a dogmatic belief system. It's like it's not been our thing, right? It's like even from the beginning. I mean, John Wesley was an abolitionist 100 years before slavery was outlawed in the in the Empire of England, of English Empire. And so we've always wrestled with the culture. We've always wrestled and struggled with that. And it's interesting to me how Methodists have, like, they go to Paul and they'll pull out a passage of scripture and say, see, this is what the Bible says. And then you miss all of like the beauty of 1 Corinthians, where Paul is always wrestling with the culture, calling the church to compromise, to defer in love with one another. Hey, I know there's nothing wrong with eating the meat sacrificed to idols. I get it. But out of love for them, don't do it, And that was the constant theme. It's why in 1 Corinthians 13, it's not just the chapter that you read at the weddings. It's the axial chapter, faith, hope, and love abide. The greatest of these is love. It's the central message of who Jesus is. So we're called to, that McLaren stage 4 harmony. Is to live in revolutionary relationship with one another, to love the Lord your God and love your neighbor, to move toward the table like Jesus, to embody Jesus is to stay at the table with sinners and tax collectors and prostitutes and reprobates and even the Pharisees who recognized they were a little too legalistic and hypocritical. They were willing to come too, but that's what the church is called to do. And it's almost like, no, we're moving away from that. We're going to isolate ourselves. We're going to, Chris goes back to like the cultural stuff. It's like culture is so spiraling out of control that the only way I can find some sense of stability in my life is if I cloister myself inside some new denomination where all the rules are clearly spelled out, and I know who's in and who's out, and I don't have to argue with you. I don't have to struggle in tension and have a hard conversation with you about this particular issue.
Yeah, for sure. And I do think that that's a fair criticism of the more evangelical end of the American church, that there's, the Benedict Option is a book that was written several years ago. It's just this idea that the culture around us is becoming more and more secular, clearly like not set, more and more set against kind of Christian principles or all the rest. And so the answer to that would be to separate and to, ultimately like kind of isolate, create, Christian schools, Christian culture, or something that's set against the broader culture. I do think that the criticism on the other side that I hear of more progressive or liberal churches is just everything goes, it's just pure assimilation, just taking whatever the culture says. We love it. Okay, that's all good and well, but it's really just an assimilation game. And I also don't think that's right. I don't think that that's a faithful posture either. And so, I think what we're gesturing towards is that there are ways to be engaged in rigorous listening and in relationship with people who are beyond the church that may have something to offer. The Spirit may be at work in those conversations or in those engagements. I do think that in order to be faithful, the church has to be engaged in this kind of conversation. So I think if isolationist is one posture that doesn't seem faithful, and assimilationist it doesn't either, I think that how to rightly engage might be where the conversation could continue. I mean, how does that sound to you?
So
when
you say that, the first thing I do, so my doctoral work was around organizational culture and leadership. And Peter Senge writes this great book called The Fifth Discipline. And in systems thinking or in systems theory, you always have this sort of, and I'm going to use spiritual terms, but you have this vision pulling you forward. All right, so the God-preferred future for us as Christians. He doesn't use that language. Then you have the current reality pulling you, and it's almost like the two poles. You're in the middle, and there's a rubber band around both ends of the pole. So you constantly have this tension going on in your life, and it's a reality all around us. And so what happened is like what you just said. If you're on sort of the more evangelical, hyper-conservative side, on that end of the extreme, you just cut the cord to the current reality, right? I'm moving all the way into what God says does, and be damned anybody else, or if Jesus says no, I'm not going to do that. In the same way, people go, well, the current reality is what it is, so we cut the cord between God's vision for preferred future, and we just assimilate into the culture. See, I don't think what he says is when you do that, you're basically responding from an emotional position. And it is not, and it's you just got to relieve the tension. That's where I think people are. I can't. So this goes back to my earlier statement. We did not do a good job teaching Christians to grow, not only to have the maturity of faith, but also that maturity requires that you creatively learn to deal with the tension that exists. You don't cut the cord on one end or cut the cord on the other end. And what Senge says is that's where generativity happens. That's where things are created. That's where transformation takes place. And so I think it's hard to tell people, we need to sit in this for a little bit. We need to sit in this darkness. We need to struggle with these differences in the extremes. But I'm with you. I don't think going to the far right or to the far left is going to be the answer. It's going to be existing in that broad middle and trying to create and learn and generate what is God calling us to be in this culture that doesn't assimilate to the culture. But also, I would say it's just as ceding to the culture just to run off and isolate yourself. That's as much of a cultural move as just aligning with all the things that are not aligning with Scripture.
One of the images that's been helpful to me, and I can't remember if it was Walter Brueggemann or if it was one of his students, Brent Strawn, that used the image. It may have been Strawn. He wrote a book on kind of biblical literacy called The Old Testament is Dying. And in the book, he's talking about how the church has lost its kind of first language, the language of the Bible. And he uses the image of a church as being bilingual. And so the sense that you got to know the first language of the faith. And there are ways in which that gets stultified. You guys have been talking about, times at which the church's language has become stale and overly dogmatic or rigid. But you still need the language of the faith. That's something. I'm a father of 3 kids, and there's nothing that I can. My son's about to start confirmation, and right now, to say, don't teach your kids the 10 Commandments or the Lord's Prayer, all that stuff is like super important because I want to pass on the faith to the next generation. And so to tell a young family, like, don't do that, I think that's ridiculous.
But
on
also,
the other hand, I do think I want my kids to know, to be able to engage when they go to college and not be scared of other ways of knowing. You know what I mean? And so to learn how, the languages of the humanities or the sciences or whatever, all of those languages enrich rather than corrupt faith. And so I don't know, I feel like both of those things are important in terms of a rich and robust faith being passed on.
Well,
Sorry to interrupt you.
You were going to say something.
No, I was interrupting you.
He was interrupting you, by the way.
Yeah, Matt, if you wouldn't have interrupted me.
John, could you maybe teach him a little bit, John?
I'm working on this. It's hard.
He just got excited. He's leaned
Usually that's me interrupting people. So
Then a band camp.
do you even remember what you were going to say now?
Yeah, I think that often we think of faith as, again, a noun and not a developmental thing. So if what we believe, this is what Christian Wyman says, if what we believe at 15 is the same thing that we believe at 50, we haven't grown. And so often what we've done with confirmation and things like that is say, learn these things and then we will confirm you in faith because you have just learned the tenets of faith. No. That's the worst thing that we can say to kids. What we need to be able to do is create a structure that says developmentally, this is going to shift. Your understanding of this is going to shift. All of this is going to shift. At this stage, this is what we want you to learn, right? Mm-hmm. And I think what we've done often is kind of create a Munchausen by proxy with folks within the church is we've kept them sick and small and dependent, and we've created a deep sense of fear in them if they move away from it, so much so that when they go out and they go to university and they think, why am I so afraid of that? They never come back. Because what we've created is a world that actually doesn't exist. It's not a world that's humanizing. It's not a world that Jesus wants to participate in. And so they leave the church having realized that there's faith outside of the church, which there is, right? And I think the church has done something and created a context that actually now has become our worst enemy. How do we then reimagine, how do we redescribe our faith in deeper biblical terms that is more relational, less institutional, less dogmatic, and deeply transformative in the world?
And I'll interrupt you.
Come on.
And say, if you go back to McLaren's stages of faith, or the stages of faith, that he's not saying stage 1 or stage 2 is a bad thing.
No, it's necessary.
It's a stage. Stage 1 is where children developmentally start. When you go into a children's Sunday school class, you're not teaching them the framework of the existential nuances of whatever. You're just teaching them the moral lesson of the story of David, right? Or how to be kind to your brother or your sister. So you're right. Then as you grow up, but if you don't prepare them, if we get stuck in stage 1 or 2, then once we get out of there, that's where I think we didn't do a good job.
No.
You go to college and all of a sudden you have a crisis of faith because no one ever said. Now there's going to be other things out there. I think as you get towards the end of high school, you need to start preparing, or we need to start preparing our kids to know what they're going to experience. Because when they go to college, unless they go to some super hyper Christian conservative school, they're going to get their test. Faith is going to be tested. I remember my first philosophy class, a guy comes in and says, God, there is no God. God is dead. And I'm like, start crying. I'm like, oh, I've never heard that before,
But even if it doesn't happen in college, it's going to happen at some point when you get into the world or when your first major life crisis happens.
Yes.
And your stage 1 or stage 2 faith doesn't help you fully understand how God can be in this and be with you in this moment.
That's right.
And how the community of faith comes around. Then you begin to not understand how can I still be faithful in this? And I see a lot of that.
Yes.
As a pastor that they haven't, I was thinking earlier, Jesus saying, in the world, not of the world, in the world, not of the world. And there's just a sense that there is the goodness of God and the work of the Holy Spirit in the world. And how do we teach our people to see and know and name and claim that as they move?
Yes.
The other image that I just think it's a good one. It's kind of evergreen in this area is this image of Jeremiah in Babylon in an environment where he's seeking the well-being and the welfare and the flourishing of those around him. It just like, that's a faithful posture, that the church would be after the flourishing and the thriving of the neighborhood.
And I would also say that doubt and the loss of faith and the questioning of faith is all necessary. All of that. And we do not prepare people for the evacuation of their, to be able to say to someone that the faith that you were given as a child, it will fail you. We don't normalize that. And if we don't make that a normal part of the faith development, we continue to create people that are more connected to a noun than a verb, more connected to something that's wanting to secure their life than to wreck their life in Jesus. And so then you don't ever have to have faith, which is another word just for risk. You never have to risk your life for anything because you've got all the cheat codes of the answer. And that's not faith. And so we've created this whole kind of intellectual kind of paradigm that now we have to undo as people of faith in order to be faithful to Christ in the world.
That reminds me of this story that Will Willimon, who was the chaplain at Duke Chapel years ago, in a sermon, he talks about this father that came up to him just really, really angry after a sermon one day. Because his daughter, who had come to Duke University to be, a doctor, had left all of the ambitions that she had come to Duke with, and ended up, in the mission field somewhere, working on the other side of the world. His father was really, really mad because she had made this decision on the basis of a sermon that Will had preached, and he was like, "You're the one that baptized her, man. You're the one that baptized her. It wasn't me. You took her to Sunday school, right? You taught her about Jesus." I do think I take the point. The faith is not just something that is a secure foundation, but it's something that might lead you to take dangerous, daring ventures into the world.
Well, and I think about Rowan Williams' understanding of baptism is that you are being pushed down into the waters of chaos. This is Genesis waters. This is not holy water. This is the water where there are demons and there is absence of God and there is chaos. And that's the world that Jesus occupies. And that's the world that Jesus saves us from and then calls us to. Right? And so none of us gets out of this with a security. Our life is upended in the life of faith. And so most of our mental constructs are trying to keep us from that. But when the shit hits the fan in our life through the death of a child, beep. Through a divorce.
Wait, podcast. Beep.
Sorry. Through something. And I'm trying to secure myself. I've created a God that actually can't take me through that, right? There's these crises of faith. I mean, is there any other kind of crisis, though?
Well, that's one of the. There was a quote we used this morning in our staff worship from Alan Watts, who is a philosopher of religion, and he's like, belief is the insistence that the truth is what one would wish. That's what the word leaf means, to wish. The believer will open his mind to the truth on the condition that it fits with their preconceived ideas and wishes. Where faith, on the other hand, is unreserved opening of the mind to truth, wherever it may turn out to be. Faith doesn't have preconceptions. I think we confuse belief and faith. Belief is very important, but we have to know what it is and how it works. And we tend to, our beliefs are rooted in a lot of, we bring our own baggage in. Yeah. If it confirms that, we're good with it. And if it disconfirms that, we don't allow space for it.
Yeah, that's right.
And then it threatens our faith.
I love that phrase, unreserved opening. That you're willing to not have something secured to go into. We could talk with you all day. And I had
But the best podcast length, they say, is like 45 to 50 minutes or 40 minutes.
I know. That's what and real quickly, let's do this we'll do it Youth Minister popcorn style. We've talked about the church, and we've talked about some of the struggles of the church. If you could give, one sentence or two or three words of what your hope for the church, or what you see as the way forward for the church would be through this moment into where God is leading us, what would you say?
Well, for me, it's been what we've said here at Chapwood a long time, is the church has to be able to embody grace, embody Jesus in the world. If we can do that, to give flesh to the life, the teachings, the ministry, the words, and the actions of Jesus. And I think if we can really take that seriously, moving out into the world, like Chris said, intersecting in the world. I mean, if I think about Jesus going out to the coffee shop, I don't see him taking a big, thick Bible and a handful of tracts and going up and interrupting everybody from their coffee and saying, "Have you been saved?" Right? I mean, I think what he's going to do, he's going to say, "Hey, so what do you do? Oh, tell me about your family." Oh, and it's kind of meeting where people are, not in a way that allows people to understand that they're worth something, and they're valued, and that you actually are interested in them, care about them. Those are the conversations that actually lead to relationships and potentially even faith conversations, rather than some pre-constructed kind of formulaic 4 steps to salvation. Right. I don't want to sound judgy there about people, but
that was more than one sentence, more than just a quick
no, we
phrase.
Don't do one sentence.
It was a
here,
run-on
Eddie.
sentence.
It's a run-on sentence. There was no.
So it's like very Faulkner-esque.
I'm like Paul in the Greek.
That's
What do you
Go, Matt. You do one sentence.
I'm gonna do words. Hyperlocal, hyper-relational, solidarity, neighborliness. I think is where
That's not one sentence either.
No, just words.
That was good.
There's no verb in there, but
Chris, what do you think?
I'll offer just prayer that the life of Jesus would come alive in me and in us.
I think for me, it's being the beloved community. How can we be the beloved community where we are? So, guys, this has been great. Why have we waited so long to do this?
We've been trying to do this for a long time.
We can't get on your star-studded calendar.
Your list of
we're like the C-listers here.
Guests. I mean,
we're not even B-listers.
Go to the Waits website and just look at all these heavy hitters they talk about.
Yeah, you guys are going to bury us in the eulogy here, aren't you?
The Wait. Yeah. Check out the Wait. Make sure you like, subscribe. Check out Eddie and Chris.
It's called The Wait. We've been waiting.
We've been waiting for the Wait.
Now, do you have a podcast? How can people find?
It doesn't really matter.
Pod Have Mercy. We're everywhere.
Pod
We're on
Have
YouTube,
Mercy.
YouTube
and everywhere else.
Podcasts. Like, subscribe, share with a friend. And just know sometimes we have to put the E on it because Matt.
We're small, but we're sexy. We're a sexy podcast.
If you want some irreverence in your life, this is where you come. If you want to be smart,
I'm gonna start listening more often so I can.
Sexy. I love that. That's good.
I should claim that for my tagline.
Hey, we love you guys. Y'all are doing great work.
Thank y'all. Y'all are too. Great to be with y'all today.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm John Stevens.
And I'm Matt Russell.
And this is Pod Have Mercy.